Okay. Right. So what we have today is a workshop. Well, we're calling it a workshop. It's really it's a chance to talk about a little bit about 75 years of OR practice, a little bit about different aspects of the history. What we'd also like to do is we'd also like to have a bit of a discussion session. So we've actually put quite a bit of the time aside to have a discussion at the end about what the history might have to tell us about what we might be doing now and what we might be wanting to do into the future, and whether there are any particular themes and things like that. For those of you, just to be aware, we are being recorded on the video camera up there. The only plan for that is that we're doing something on the 75th anniversary. We have a theme on the 75, on the past, the present, and the future of OR. So one of the things we thought was that some of the things that come out in here might be useful kind of things to put on the website. So don't worry that your every thought will be sort of promulgated to the world in general. It's just so that people are aware that that's what's happening, and the camera's up there. Okay, so my name's John Medhurst, and I'm the chair of this session, and we have three eminent speakers. We have Roger Forder, John Ranyard, and Alan Robinson, who are each going to talk about a different aspect of those 75 years of OR practice. This is the session outline, so we're going to have three talks. The first one will be on the history of OR in defence, presented by Roger. Then we're going to have a talk on the history of OR in British coal, which will be presented by John Ranyard over there. And then Alan Robinson will talk about the history of the Heads of OR and Analytics Forum, or HORAF. And if we could have questions at the ends of each talk, and then, as I say, there'll be an actual, quite prolonged discussion session at the end. Okay, so, if I just... we go to here, we'll get that up, and I will hand the floor over to Roger.
Okay, thank you, John. Reading glasses on. Right, well, let me, although we're obviously looking at the 75 years starting 1948, let me, the indulgence of stepping back about 10 years to start with, because as we know, operational research as a distinct discipline under that name had its origins in defence, and those origins go back to the late 1930s, when radar scientists came out of their labs and helped the Royal Air Force organise the air defence of the UK in the run-up to World War II. And thereafter, from the outbreak of the war in 1939, the discipline spread rapidly, and we like to think very successfully, in support of all three British services. And of course the name of Patrick Blackett was particularly prominent. Now of course OR in World War II was all about analysing operational data from the continuous stream of operations that was obviously going on, to advise commanders about tactics and the best use of equipment. And indeed, to this end, as Blackett himself wrote in 1941, the main field of their activity is clearly the analysis of actual operations, using as data the material to be found in an operations room. For example, all signals, track charts, combat reports, met information, etc. Well, that was fine in 1941. Until the end of the war. But if we step forward to our proper starting point in 1948, then when the OR Club, this is celebrating 75 years old, when the OR Club was founded in April 48, then the war had been over for nearly 3 years. So what did that mean for Defence OR? Well, the first point to note is that certainly in the UK, Defence OR still did exist. OR groups had been retained within all three services. And that was not a given, because with no significant operations going on, there would have been good arguments in just winding the whole thing up and letting the highly qualified scientists go back to their universities or to industry or wherever. In fact, interestingly enough, in Canada, which had a wartime OR group, they did actually disband it at the end of the war, and then actually reconstituted it not long after. I forget that maybe in about 1950. But in fact, in the UK, there was solid support from the military for OR to continue. But okay, what did they do? What were they going to do without a war going on? Well, obviously there was a vast quantity of wartime data that could still be analysed. But of course the point about that is that much of that data would only be useful if we were thinking about an operational context not too different from the wartime experience. But as we know only too well, many aspects of the operational context changed profoundly as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s. Atomic weapons were already with us, followed in the early 50s by thermonuclear devices, the hydrogen bomb. By 1948, the Cold War between East and West was already a reality. And there are also plenty of mold-breaking changes in conventional weapon technology in the pipeline. Examples there. So the focus of our defence had to change. Rather than making sense of real day-to-day operations in order to improve their effectiveness, the focus of the work was now on the future, supporting decisions about the future size and shape of the armed forces and their equipment needs. And there were plenty of new and expensive equipment options emerging from the R&D labs. Direct support to frontline commanders did continue, but at a relatively low level, and largely concerned with the analysis of exercise trials. So how did Defence OR develop in response to these new needs? Well, essentially by adopting a more general approach to the modelling of military operations with a broader range of inputs. And these inputs, they would include trials and exercise data wherever possible, but also engineering estimates, military judgment, intelligence information, sheer guesswork. Yes, altogether a different data set than that which Blackie and his colleagues were used to using in the war, and that was inevitable. But what about methods? Well, to start with, OR teams used the same essentially manual, analytical and statistical methods that had been used in the war, even though the data inputs were different. However, new approaches soon began to make their impact. One of the first new ideas which the post-war analysts co-opted was wargaming. Now, wargaming had, of course, a long history in the training of commanders and the evolution of strategy and tactics. But as an analytical tool, it could be thought of simply as a model of operations with men in the loop to provide the decision-making element. War games, at first purely manual, but later computer-assisted, soon began to play a major role in analysis. But that said, they're not ideal as an analysis tool. They're rather slow, labour-intensive, and therefore unable to undertake the multiple replications needed to produce statistically reliable results. And these, incidentally, are actual photographs of sort of war gaming in probably about the early 60s from the Army, UK's Army Operational Research Establishment at West Byfleet. They're not the sharpest photographs, but they're interesting historically. Now, war games, okay, they were well established in the military domain when analysts picked them up. But game theory was new to all except professional mathematicians. Interest in the military OR community can be dated essentially to 1947, with the second edition of the now famous book, The Theory of Games and Economic Behaviour, by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. I mean, its ideas seem naturally applicable to military issues, and I must admit there was considerable enthusiasm generated. To be honest, that enthusiasm never really bore as much fruit as might have been hoped, but it did have quite an impact in early thinking about nuclear deterrence, and interest has revived in more recent times in the context of things like peace support operations. Perhaps of more significance, one of the classic and obviously enduring OR techniques, namely linear programming, also made its appearance in the post-war years. In fact, as a usable technique, it had its origins in the military analysis community, when in 1947, George Dstl developed the simplex method of solution when he was working for the US Air Force. And with its subsequent elaborations, integer and mixed integer programming, it's continued to form the basis for optimization approaches to a wide variety of military problems, especially logistics. But although it was used to some extent from the late 40s onwards, linear programming really needed the ready available of serious computer power in the early 1960s before its promise was fully realised. And the advent of powerful mainframe computers was certainly the greatest single influence on defence OR from the mid-60s right into the 80s. And of course, that's true of other areas of OR as well. That said, probably the greatest impact of the availability of serious computing power was in opening the door to simulation. And in the Cold War era, simulation enabled us to model almost any type of postulated military operation. Rather than just sort of one-on-one fighter engagements to the whole shooting match either on land or at sea. But all still with the aim of working out how best to use a defence budget that was becoming more and more tight squeezed. In fact, there were several pressures that encouraged the development of ever more elaborate warfare simulations. As I've implied, simulation, particularly discrete event simulation, is a pretty natural paradigm for modelling combat operations. There was a remorseless increase in the available computing power, which analysts sort of snapped up greedily. Simulation had the flexibility to cope with continuing pressure from military clients for ever-increasing levels of detail in modelling, even if, to be frank, that was often unnecessary or even counterproductive. And on the wider scene during the 1960s, NATO moved away from the doctrine of massive nuclear retaliation to that of flexible response, and this put more emphasis on looking at big conventional wars. But we were painfully aware that big simulations were not always better simulations in terms of gaining understanding, especially given the inevitably rather speculative inputs that we had to use. But they did fill an important market need, and I personally spent quite a lot of time playing with them. But it was the events around the turn of the 1990s that brought about a broadening of the defence OR toolkit. Key dates are there. The Cold War, or at least the old Cold War, ended really quite suddenly, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in the Soviet Union. The first Gulf War was fought with notable success. And Yugoslavia began to break up, with the first UN peacekeepers, including British troops, deployed to Bosnia and Croatia in 1992. So the geopolitical environment that had dominated Western defence planning ever since the late 1940s just suddenly evaporated. It was almost exactly halfway point in my 36 career in the ministry. So I saw both bits at some great length. Anyway, these events dictated obviously a major change in the issues which OR needed to address. we had to consider many scenarios rather than just the one big one. And indeed a wide spectrum of scenarios, from conventional war on the sort of Gulf War scale, through anti-terrorist interventions, to peace support operations. And some of these operations were not very amenable to simulation, or not given the data that we had on them. And of course we were also seeking an overall force structure that was flexible enough to deal with all these possibilities, some of them concurrent as well, rather than just one big one at a time. And because most operations would now be expeditionary, i.e. at some distance from the UK with no in-place forces, we also needed a lot more logistics analysis. And also, since we weren't focusing simply on existential threats to the nation, there was much greater emphasis on issues such as casualties and collateral damage, and that meant a whole new area of analysis needed to be explored. But going back to the first bullet here, probably the most significant problem was understanding, that is modelling, the effectiveness of military forces in peace support operations. Here are some pictures from Balkans in the first half of the 90s. Peace support operations include both peacekeeping and the sort of more exacting peace enforcement. But in both cases, the aim is to achieve objectives with the minimum use of lethal force, while nevertheless being seen to have the lethal force available if required. And ideally, there must be tight coordination with political and diplomatic action. In other words, for preference, they are pass-a-mind campaigns. And in this context, of course, understanding the relationship between what forces you send, how you use them, and results achieved, well, it's not easy to say the least. I mentioned some of the approaches I've used, and I guess probably still using. And unsurprisingly, you'll see that soft methods are quite prominent. Game theory has made a reappearance. And of course, in needing or trying to analyse as much real-world data as we could lay our hands on, you wouldn't be wrong in noticing that at least some return to OR's wartime roots are relevant here. The use of a wider range of methods was much facilitated by another revolution that overtook us in the 1990s, the desktop computing revolution. And that's a pretty old desktop, first one I used anyway. And the power of the PC soon overtook what any sensible analyst would want to use in making ever more complex models. Rather, the power could be used to make simulations more understandable and easier to use. And graphical input and output meant that we could see at a glance what is going on. Hands up to those who recognise the Clarion model. But, and the PC also brought with it a range of other tools for quick analysis and model building. And so trying new approaches involved much less start-up time than before. Perhaps too many of these approaches involve the dreaded spreadsheet, but that's a story for another presentation. Finally, the 1990s also breathed new life into the idea of OR in direct support of forces in the field. In the first Gulf War, a small group of analysts and scientists were attached to the British Armour Division and did very well regarded work, not just in on-the-spot analysis, but also in providing a link to scientific support back in the UK. Our teams led by the UK were then also deployed with NATO forces in the Balkans, and this resulted in a number of interesting analytical developments, in particular in measuring how far operations were actually achieving a resumption of the desired state of normality, peaceful normality. And though our teams were also deployed in Afghanistan, people in the know will recognise Les, Ruskell and colleagues in Afghanistan. The work of these on-the-spot teams was also much facilitated by what I might call the laptop revolution, there's John Owen with his laptop in a tent. And the laptops obviously allow quite powerful software tools to be taken with them and to be brought to bear quickly and usefully, even when the analyst was metaphorically in the back of beyond. Although I'm scheduled to go up to 2023, I'll sort of stop there because I retired from Mod 13 years ago in 2010. Since then, the geopolitical merry-go-round has continued to turn, and eyes are once again on conventional conflict in Europe. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of the analytical methods and models of the Cold War have been sort of updated, dusted off, and are playing a useful role in aiding and advising our decision makers in the current context. Perhaps Alan will answer the question on that in Q&A, or perhaps you won't. Also, I mean, two important technical areas that sort of really opened up in recent years, which I know next to nothing about. Analytics and so-called big data and AI. I put up two, off the top of my head, ideas as to where these might be making or could make a difference to defence OR. Finally, I mean, first it would be great to make better use of effectively about 30 years of data from real operations from Gulf War I onwards, which I'm sure you're not into. I've never really got to grips with it, so perhaps analytical big data can help with that. As far as AI is concerned, one of the issues in modelling, whether from the Cold War or later, whether in hot war or peace support operations, has been modelling human decision making. Either our commanders, the enemy commanders, or the factions involved in the peace support operation. Can we use AI embedded in our models to represent that better? But perhaps Alan can tell us more, or perhaps he can't, but if you can, I'd be very interested to hear that myself. So thank you for listening.
Right, and I'll actually do what I should have done right at the beginning.
Can you hear me?
No, it's but yes, I can hear you, but it's for the recording.
Oh, so, well, that's probably good then, isn't it?
So first, do we have any questions on what we just...
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, that's really interesting. How do you feel the influence of drones in warfare is going to impact on the use of operational research? Because when we're talking about reducing casualties and so on, then drones aren't casualties if they're knocked out, for example. Can you see a future in warfare where we're more like Star Wars, where we've got machines fighting rather than humans?
Well, yes, but I mean, it's often talked about. I mean, in fact, the interesting thing is that, certainly through the second half of my career, often did analysis, certainly to look at the mix of systems for surveillance and indeed for attack. And we repeatedly came up with recommendations of using, well, what we call UAVs, sort of unmanned aerial vehicles. And to be honest, the military customers, for perhaps obvious reasons, tended to turn their nose up a bit at that. It was only when we actually started sort of fighting small wars again that they came into their own, and some of the things we said were actually proved to be justified. So yeah, I mean, the issue of collateral damage and casualties, I mean, certainly, well, obviously the use of drones reduces casualties on our side, but once again, the issue of collateral damage, dropping bombs on innocent parties and so on, is a major issue. And the technological solutions and so on are a bit different compared with manned aircraft, but it's all grist to the military and OR mill. Yeah.
I think it's just think about stripping out the human fallibilities, because machines will do what you tell them to do, won't they, in a way that humans might not behave in quite the same way. So I'm just wondering how that impacts on the influence of OR in terms of planning wars and stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure OR can deal with it, and as I say, if we're using AI in some ways, but I mean, but I think the issues it presents are sort of more sort of legal and moral and so on than any particular issue for OR. I mean, normally, you know, OR can cope with anything really.
Thank you, great summaries. Are there any perennials that you could detect looking through the decades of OR that have actually kept going, even if the ways that things are applied have adapted as the technologies have changed?
Sorry, I've forgotten what was just that last bit. Sorry.
So it was about, are there perennials in operation which basically are always there, although the technologies will change from year to year?
Well, I think it's the human, it must be the human component. I mean, it comes to the fore in different ways, or at least seen to. I mean, in the Cold War days, there was this issue of command and control, top-down or mission command. And then when we go into peace support operations, it was, well, how do the people you're trying to sort of not piece together or keep apart or whatever, you know, how are they thinking, how will they react to what you do? So, you know, the particular context in which it pops up could be different, but you know, the understanding of human response and human decision making, you know, really probably the perennial and probably in the end unsolvable issue, but we always do our best.
We'll have a discussion session at the end where we can go in more general. Thank you very much indeed, Roger.
Right, well, I can't quite follow the professionalism of Roger's. I thought I was reasonable at PowerPoint, found I wasn't, went on to Google Slides, put a lot of text on the slides and it looked really dull, so I employed my son to jazz it up a bit. There are some illustrations, some of which are relevant to the text, some of which are relevant to the times that I'm talking about. You'll see what I mean as we go along. So, the National Coal Board was actually formed in 1947, and at that point, which is very critical, the demand for coal outstripped supply, just after the war, of course. Board members were set up. The board member for science was Sir Charles Ellis, and he'd been involved in OR during the war, and he was quite keen to set up an OR group in the Coal Board. Eventually, in 1948, the Field Investigation Group was formed, FIG, in London, but providing services to the whole of the industry. And the complement at that time was 1 scientist and 5 junior grades. And I better read this out to you. And this is because of the demand for coal the supply of coal needing to be expanded. To provide an objective analysis of the chain of operations from the coal face to the surface, and to establish the cost of each link in terms of power, manpower, and effort generally. I think that's an early computer that we've got there. Just ignore the diagram for the photo for the moment. Now, a significant event was Pat Rivett being employed as the head of FIG. Many of you will know him, very charismatic character, very engaging, very persuasive, very outgoing. And he expanded the group. But the specific thing that he did that maybe others didn't in UK OR, he visited America. And around 54, 55, he did discover OR techniques. I'm going to come back to that. Anyway, by the 1957, he'd increased the group size to 50 or so. And in 1957, because of his involvement in British OR, Pat Rivett got involved in the very first IFORS conference in 1957, which seems to be labelled as the first UK OR conference. Charles Goodeve, who is well known to many as a pioneer of OI, he was head of BISRA, and I believe Akoff from America were the organising forces for this first conference. And Pat Rivett, as you can see, looking at the photos, he's third from the right. Charles Goodeve is on the left. For the whole of UK OR, who attended that conference, they're sort of blown away by all these techniques, OR techniques, that weren't being used very much in the UK. Most of the UK work was pragmatic and statistically oriented, and suddenly there were these magic techniques. Now, what happened after that conference, and through Pat Rivette's visit to America, 50 scientists stopped work for 3 months to learn OR techniques. I mean, that seems astounding looking back now. And then they were able to train new entrants, because there were very little in the way of postgraduate OR training at that time. BISRA was running a scheme at LSE, but there were no full-time departments of OR at that time. So in 1958, 28 LP projects were set up. I mean, there's lots of scope for LP, sort of allocating resources in an optimal way. And only 8 of those were judged successful. In fact, there are some parallels there with AI now, I think, because it was all about the data. And for some planning operations, the data was very extensive, and it was difficult to keep up with real time, believe it or not. There was a solution. If we got a matrix generator, we could speed everything up. And one of the clients, in an apocryphal tale, wondered if a matrix generator would fit in the boot of his car. That was a joke going around the department at the time. So there was little use of computers then, although they were in existence, and most of the LPs were solved with with electric calculators. And the manufacturers of the devices were facets, and the workers involved were facet bashers. And you can imagine, they were day after day in a room with their calculators trying to solve these LPs. But there was one critical project that was carried out there. Then there was a major underground incident at Cresswell Colliery in the 50s, which resulted in a major loss of life. And a lot of lives were lost because the communications underground were very poor. So FIG set about collecting lots and lots of information, which eventually did need a lot of analysis, and they did use a digital computer at the National Physical Laboratory. And as we became more professional, we did attend report writing and effective speaking courses. FIG in the 50s, too, you all know who that is. So that project I've just mentioned is one of them. And if you look at them all, conveyor belt lives, basically, some of you will not fully understand coal mining. You build a shaft, there are coal seams, you drive faces along the coal seams, and then you transport the coal from the coal face to the shaft, up the shaft to the surface. So conveyor belting was very important, and so we were looking at conveyor belt lives. The optimizing coal to power station transportation, that was a paper given at the first I4's conference in 1957, one of the few LP studies by UK people at that conference. But the last one there, understanding the causes of labour wastage, is starting to move away from just concentrating on coal mining and improving it. Brian Holden became the head in 1960, and at the time there was a culture where publications in journals, in ORQ, was encouraged, so staff did publish papers. We had colloquia where we invited external speakers to talk about interesting topics. We got wide-ranging discussions of the direction of projects from people outside the existing. So this American visitor, and we are trying to track down the quote, claimed that at that time, in the early 60s, FIG was the graduate school of OR in the UK. But we did become the OR branch a little bit later, so we are now respectable. That's what we wanted to be. That's what we were doing. The board then agreed to double the complement, 70 and then 80, and started recruiting 20 graduates a year. And I was one of 23 graduates that joined in 1963. In 3 years later, only 3 of those survived, and obviously I was one of them. Before I joined in 1963, the Observer newspaper ran a major article on FIG, as it then was, Lord Roban's, who was the chairman of the National Coal Board, Lord Roban's mine of information. And because of our increased complement, we needed to sell OR more, so there were lots of appreciation courses given to senior managers. Now, my first link, I've mentioned computers already. Some OR groups managed to get mini computers in their departments, United Steel and BISRA, both headed by 2 very charismatic people who were obviously very persuasive. But we were relying on the mainframe and eventually getting 2 turnarounds a day, which was pretty disappointing if you were developing programs. And we started to recruit social scientists and also introducing OR approaches on staff college courses. So that helped us to disseminate the value of OR. And the critical development then in training was setting up this 2-year part-time MSc course at Brunel University, 1 day a week for 2 years, and that took away the training load from internal to an external course and gave a recognised qualification. And we did develop project control and client management. I mean, all of these topics are just words on the screen, but that in itself is quite a lengthy discussion. OR studies, well, again, you can see stockholding costs. These are all mainly related to mining and looking at the life cycle costs of mining machinery. But another example of moving away from just coal production, at the time in the 60s, oil and gas were becoming more available and more popular, so we needed to optimize the advertising costs of domestic coal promotion. And you see 1 or 2 others. The final one there, designing methods for designing underground coal transport systems were developed. Simulation was used, and variable for that situation where you've got variable coal production because there is inherent variability in the coal mining process. And designing the size of the belts and bunkers that could smooth the flow of coal was quite a difficult task. We used simulation and we devised packages which local staff could employ without our involvement, and that was for some other techniques as well, and that's something that I come back to a bit later. After 21 years, in 1969, we wrote a book, the department, not published until 1971, OR Comes of Age, and that reviewed the work that we'd done and some of the lessons that we learned. At the same time, early 70s, we became the OR executive, which increased our status, gave us a board of management of senior directors and managers, and that's who we reported to. And one thing that we did do was to ensure that clear-cut savings that were validated by the clients more than outweighed by a margin the costs of running the department. And this is always a difficulty for OR groups. You tend to get valued more for work at the strategic level, but it's much more difficult to quantify the value of that work. So the tactical work, in a sense, was subsidising the strategic work for which we were more greatly valued. We set up local units in Yorkshire and Midlands. This is all part of the general expansion, and that's when I moved to Yorkshire to head up the Yorkshire group, and that made us very, very close to local managers. And surprisingly, I guess, we were given approval to carry out work outside British Coal. And we started work for the Health Service and British Waterways Board, and then others. And one point about that was, there's always discussions internally departments have budgets that they can use to pay for OR, but if external companies are paying those rates as well, that gives a confidence to management in British Coal that you're doing a good service. But one critical thing that links with some of the work that Roger was saying, computer-oriented work, we eventually managed to get our own mini computer, and that was a huge battle with the data processing department. They wanted to control all computing in the organisation, but they were very much focused on computerising existing tasks, computerising clerical tasks. And being IBM, as you know, nobody got sacked for buying IBM. IBM brought out a new computer every 2 years. These are mainframe computers, of course, that were twice as powerful and half the cost of the previous generation. So the data processing department had this underwriting for their success. But I'll come back to IT later on. At the end of that, George Mitchell becomes director. I miss Rolf Tomlinson. So Rolf Tomlinson's a previous president. George Mitchell is a previous president of the OR Society. And in the projects now, we are still doing work outside, very much outside production, as well as some within. And the demand for power station coal, at the time, gas and oil were competing with coal in power stations, and it was a price elastic situation. So we could forecast, given the prices of coal and our estimates of the price of oil and gas, we could predict the demand for coal, and that was very, very helpful to the industry. And external work, hospital supplies we did studies on, and then given that we had a lot of local coalfield managers now close at hand, we did a lot of ad hoc studies there as well. Well, I'll take that off, but read it quickly. It's in the book that Graham's got, Maurice Kirby's History of OR in the UK, which is up to 1970. Going on to the 80s, this is where, again, Roger hinted at this, where microcomputers started to transform the availability of computing power to OR groups. And we eventually, through the 80s, reached 1 PC per desk. But they did fuel the growth of decision support systems. And one advantage was that you could take your microcomputer, sometimes they were quite heavy in the early days, put it on the manager's desk and demonstrate a model that you were developing so that you got visual interactive planning. And that proved to be a very powerful technique. And in fact, I'll see later that the underground transport packages became interactive decision support systems. I will gloss over the miners' strike. I'm very bitter about it because I was in in Yorkshire where the strike was 100%. My staff had to for a whole year to perform safety studies. So most of the OR stopped in the unit. It didn't stop in London because there was no strike there. And it didn't stop in the Midlands because the East Midlands miners didn't accept Arthur Scargill's rather dictatorial decision to call a national strike. I've got that off my chest, thank you. Now, going back to computing, this is quite an interesting one, that very far. We didn't get on with the computing service. They're called Compower, but they're a data processing department. They found it difficult to recruit and retrain graduates, so they gave up recruiting graduates. I mean, how balmy is that? So the service they were giving to the industry was frankly second rate. And eventually this became realised at the senior level, and George Mitchell became head of OR and IT services. IT and OR services. I mean, they were 10 times the size of us with a much bigger budget. But that was a sort of a vote of confidence in the OR approach compared to the then IT approach. So I've said Simbelt interactive we got into new mine planning, but here's a very interesting one that we did internally and externally, assisting organisational culture change when former nationalised industries suddenly found themselves in a competitive environment. We designed management games to help them to understand what the implications were of that. And you can see we did some for British Coal because of the difficulty in selling some, in a very domestic coal in a very competitive environment, and NHS and London buses. So that's very much moving into a sort of a different area that you wouldn't expect from an OR group in a coal mining industry. What happened in the 90s? Well, look at that. Demand for coal was contracting rapidly after the miners' strike, and ORE was beginning to stand out. We were 150, perhaps 130 strong. All the other departments were closing down in relation to the contracting size of British coal. We were still there. We had a budget. If we could have covered our costs, then that we could still recruit and maintain our size. But we were beginning to stick out a bit like a sore thumb. So eventually, we negotiated a contract out of British Coal into Hoskins, an external management consultancy, which was later taken over by Capgemini. And whereas Bob Scott over there took over the OR team in Capgemini. I might say a few words about that when I've finished. Well, there's lots of things there. I did wonder about highlighting, what I think are the really key success factors, but we might talk about that if there's time in the discussion. There's some references there. I'm hoping to write this up in detail, maybe for the Inside OR. I've done quite a few articles there before. But this is the final point I wanted to make, because there are 7 OR Society presidents from British Coal. They're all listed there. And I mentioned ORE being or FIG rather, being the Graduate School of OR in the UK. Well, by 1970, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ex-FIG and ORB staff had got university chairs. There's a lot more now, not only in OR, but I know even at Lancaster there's one in marketing, that's Jeff Easton, and one in finance, David Otley, who both came through the ORE. So I think I've got there, and thanks for listening. Didn't do this. So.
Thank you very much, John.
Ian? Oh, go on, yeah.
Do you know if the group in London,
Go on.
during the 70s strike, do you know if they were doing any work to deal with issues arising from the strike?
I don't think so. But there's a lot of work that still needed to go on, like marketing. As an aside, Thatcher made sure that the coal stocks were very, very high when the national strike took place. So there was still a need to transport that coal from the stockpiles to the market. So that sort of work would have been done. But I don't think there's anything at all about, you think of the softer aspects of the strike. Is that right? Okay.
You mentioned management gains, for example.
Yeah.
How were those sold to management?
I honestly don't think I can answer that because I didn't have any involvement at all. But we did have a big involvement in the Coal Board Staff College, mostly for the more quantitative work that we were doing. So we had ready clients there, and I think the Staff College management would have been aware of the need to enable senior managers to anticipate strong competition when previously they hadn't been under. So it started at Coal Board Staff College, and then when that was found to be successful, it went to the health service where we had contacts already for more traditional OR work, and the London buses one came, I think, from just the selling. We've done this with these two organisations. We think you will benefit from it. So that's how it went on.
It's just struck me that during the 70s, oil companies, or particularly Shell, did a lot of thinking about the future. Did a lot of early scenario planning, thinking 10, 20 years ahead. Was anything going on about the coal, the future of coal, those in the time scale?
Yeah, at that time, if you start in the 80s, probably in the late 70s, the demand for coal was going down, and then there was a strike, but that didn't really stop the decline. Oil was one of these strong competitors, and as I've said, the demand for oil and coal in power stations was very price elastic. So if oil decided to reduce their costs, then there would be a consequence to the coal board. I don't know if that's helpful.
Just on that point, John,
Yeah.
I worked with the industrial section at
Ah,
the time in
yeah.
Home House,
Yeah.
and one of the biggest competitors for the British coal industry was actually imported coal.
Mm.
So coal was being effectively stripped. They'd removed the soil, they'd removed the coal, and they put the soil back. Colombia, Australia, Canada.
Yeah, I do remember that.
Technique called mountain top removal.
Yeah,
Where they
yeah.
removed the top of the mountain and stripped.
So they weren't digging deep holes at their great expense to get the coal,
The
yeah.
model that I was working on then was looking at a decision support system to understand the transportation and import costs.
Yeah,
So when we were bidding against
yeah, yeah.
imported coal for large industrial customers like Dstl
Mm.
and others. But it's a very good point that Jeff made, that I'm not sure that we could have made any influence at the political level, because I think the politicians that made their decision, they wanted to get rid of the mining industry as they had with the steel industry. And in that sense, we had no competitive advantage whatsoever against the likes of oil and gas.
I remember in the 60s, the government, well, I can't remember which department, well, it'd be the departments keep changing name, but it would be the Department for Energy, tried to build a fuel economy model involving coal, oil, gas, and would there be anything else at the time? The hydro, I suppose, there was a limited amount of electricity generation from hydropower at the time. And at the time, Lord Robens wasn't, I mean, he's a former politician, a very strong character, so he knew how to treat politicians. He refused to cooperate. The oil industry gave all their detailed data, and I think the gas industry. And we actually gave individual colliery information to the government so that it would fit into their model, but we didn't tell our bosses, and we were very fearful that we might be discovered at some point. I say that was as early as the late 60s when I got involved in that. Sorry, I think I've gone on a bit there. Okay, thank you. Any more? He would.
Your fourth point down there, John, is that this is because my understanding was that Pat Rivet particularly encouraged members of staff to get very involved with the clients, including going underground and so on. Is that am I correct?
Yes, there wasn't a strong need for that. I mean, I think it obviously helps if you're prepared to go underground. I mean, it's safe, but it is very dark and it is dangerous and dusty and so on. Yeah, that would have a really good impression. As an aside, when I was at Manchester Business School in 1972, that's just before I moved to Doncaster, I invited a group of about a dozen senior managers that were on the management course I was on at the Manchester Business School to an underground visit, because I thought that would be interesting to them to see what some working lives are like. And the managers were a bit naughty, really. We went round in small groups, and there were powered supporting the roof. And the manager would get to this, it's a seam about this high, and you crouch down, you've got all your equipment on. There's coal mining going, there's a huge noise and all the dust coming up. And he would lower a powered support, and the roof would come down with it, and there'd be enormous cracks and incredible noise. I mean, he knew he could do that safely, but these, bank managers were rather
But that was very much exemplified by Gene Woolsey in the States, where all of his students would have to get really immersed in the projects that they were undertaking.
Yeah.
But one of my favourite Pat Rivet stories is about sending off some staff up to the northwest to investigate why there was absenteeism in the pits and so on. In 1956. And then Pat was watching the test match on television and saw his two members of staff also. So I called them into the office when they got back, and they said, well, we were studying the problems of absenteeism.
Well, there's another apocryphal quote on that. Lord Robens to a miner, why do you only work 3 days a week? And he says, well, I can't afford to oh no, I've got it the wrong way around. Does it work or not? Because I can't afford to live on, no, it doesn't work. I'll think about that. Yeah, okay, so you, yeah, take that. No. Okay. Thank you. I know it is, isn't it? Yes.
So, Alan Robinson, and for anybody expecting me to answer the questions Roger set me up for, I'm here in my capacity as an ex-chair of HORAF, not as a current member of Dstl or Defence. So I might talk in the bar or over lunch about defence issues, but I'm certainly not here to present on them today. I'm going to offer something that's a little bit, hopefully, complementary to the coverage that we've had so far, and from a slightly different perspective. So this is very much about some of the OR practitioner groupings and how they've evolved and how the practitioner community has talked to itself about OR and the OR that we're up to. So it's very much from that perspective, and as I say, hopefully will complement what we've already been hearing. So I'm not going to dwell overly on the early background. It certainly predates me, but post-World War II, as we've heard, rapid adoption of OR by defence, the nationalised industry starting to set up, and then private companies taking things up, and eventually, and I can say that in this community, although Ian might counter me, eventually non-defence government picking up the baton and taking things on. In the 1970s, the heads of the OR groups in the nationalised industries thought it was about time they started to talk to each other, and a heads of OR group in nationalised industries was set up to start to communicate about things. And I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of things they talked about in a couple of slides' time. And by '86, there was a commission on the future practice of OR set up by the Society, and that recommended setting up a thing called the Heads of OR Groups Committee. And I won't read this word for word, but essentially what it says is, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had such a grouping? Here's one that already exists, let's formalise it. You'll see there's some other recommendations there that never quite came to pass, like setting up an organised annual conference for the group. What did happen was the Society setting up some of the administrative services and supporting groups that were then set up. So interesting that back in '86, those were the sorts of things that they were saying. And at the bottom of that list, production of an annual report on what's going on in OR, what's going on across the community, organisational trends, growth in decline, or growth or decline in size of groups, what I would loosely call the health of the OR community. And the publishing of an annual salary survey also appears towards the bottom of the list. You know, can we benchmark and baseline across the community? Some of those ideas happened in practice, some happened for a little while and then stopped. Some went away for a number of years and then reappeared, but it's certainly prescient to some of those ideas. As ever, there's an acronym soup of these things. So this is the evolution of the acronyms, but it tells a tale in itself as well. So the first meeting of this heads of OR groups, the Commission suggested, the HORG, was in 1987. At the time, it was managed by a hawk, so just to keep the confusion of acronyms going. But importantly, by 1990, we had a permanent chair for the heads of our group, with the OR Society providing the administrative and secretariat support to that. There was another OR Society review in the early 2000s, which basically said, there are too many OR committees and we don't need as many OR committees as this, as a result of which the thing called HORAF, the Heads of OR Forum, was set up. It was no longer a formal OR Society grouping, but still remains closely affiliated to the OR Society. I mean, HORAF probably wouldn't thrive very well without the Society, and I would certainly advocate that the Society needs a HORAF, so I think that match is still there. The sort of permanent secretary role moved across to John Ranyard in 2008, and then in the early 2010s we moved across to a wider model of running that community with a co-chair model to give us some resilience in sort of meeting organisations, and a wider steering group, which I'll allude to in the next slide, to make sure that we were taking account of all the things that the group needed to focus on, and not just on what the chairman thought might be a good idea for the group to talk about. Interestingly, in 2015, we changed our name, deliberately added an A into the acronym whilst preserving most of the brand. I mean, that was in response to the changes in analytics at the time, the emergence of data science. And we seem to have a perennial debate about whether HORAF is the right name going forwards and whether we should add data science or machine learning or any other acronyms into there. But my personal view is HORAF is long enough and it's probably got sufficient cachet and leverage that it probably works for most members of the community. So I'll concentrate a little bit on this slide and pick up some of the topics there around the key areas of discussion, and some of those mirror those changes in name. The group hasn't particularly concentrated on techniques and technical topic areas. There's been a certain amount of sharing in that space, and the community has been used to sort of set up point-to-point links or to support special interest groups or other events in areas of interest, but it hasn't been a group which has concentrated on technical presentations from members to members. What we always do is allow the host organisation the prerogative to have a presentation if it wants to present something, or open an opportunity more widely to folk if they would like it. So we do have an element of technical presentations, but that's not the main area. And as you might expect, over time, those have shifted from very much hard OR methods in the early days through the evolution into softer OR practice and more soft methods, and now increasingly around machine learning, data science related activities. So the technical areas of interest of HORAF have evolved over time. And deliberately, HORAF has gone back to revisit areas that are actually not necessarily in decline, but haven't been given as much coverage elsewhere. So HORAF ran a review of soft OR across the practitioner base a couple of years ago now, which just set to re-baseline that and find out who is actually doing what and in what ways they're contributing to that. Beyond the technical topics, though, there have been a series of pervasive issues that have either run throughout or that have been revisited periodically. And I've listed some of those there, as well as a couple that have occurred in more recent years. So the recurring ones, and you might anticipate these, are things like training. How are we approaching training? Which groups do it internally? Which groups try and do it externally? What is the blend of those things? How does that work? How are they doing it effectively? And can we share best practice in how we do those sorts of things? Similarly with recruitment and with leadership. Some of us are in OR groups and run OR groups. Some of us sit in other groups but practice OR, and we're all organised differently. How is OR organised and how is OR led, both within the OR community but also within the broader groups in which we work? Health, I mentioned earlier, has been a recurring issue. And the more recent ones, again, a couple of obvious ones there, but diversity, probably wasn't something that was hugely on the radar back in the 70s, 80s, or I won't try and put a break point in there, but certainly much more coverage these days than previously. And of course, recently, given COVID, we've done a lot more work around what do working patterns look like, how do different organisations make that work well, what does hybrid working look like in various organisations, and how do folk make meetings and customer interactions and all that side of things work well. Beyond those areas of discussion, a few other points there. HORG, as I suggested, was almost by invitation, a small number of almost identifiable heads of OR groups in nationalised industries. I mean, that's a fairly defined role, and therefore it was a fairly small community. HORAF has grown over time, and its coverage has grown over time. The addition of government, the addition of now organisations from consultancy, from different parts of practice, and various different sort of areas of industry. So it's got very broad coverage these days, and the sorts of things we discuss vary as a consequence of that. We run meetings quarterly. As I said, typically a customer organisation hosts. Post-COVID and during COVID, we've been doing a lot more online and a hybrid mix of meetings. We tend to do either all online or all face-to-face rather than trying a hybrid session as a one. But that's the way we've currently worked. We've also started to work very much more closely with COPUL, the Committee of Professors in OR, to get that academic practitioner link. And we've run joint workshops with COPUL on topics of mutual interest. They're interested in what practitioners want out of their graduates and more senior recruits. And we want to know what they are teaching, make sure we get the graduates and input that we want. So there are sweet spots there that we identify and work with COPUL on. And we work very closely, as I say, with the OR Society, our Society President, Executive Director, or a rep comes to our meetings, and that allows HORAF to support and influence what the ORS is up to. And as the President walks into the room, for me to say that HORAF can then influence what we would like as practitioners the OR Society to be doing. So HORAF has got a voice in that direction and as a two-way conduit into those things. So some examples there. We provide practitioner input and support into ORS events like this one. We can support responses to government consultations and initiatives and to big things that are going on, such as the Maths Academy, and what is the practitioner role and voice in that, where we've also been strongly involved. So some of the sorts of things we talk about. Just for the record, and out of interest, and recognise a lot of the names on this list, I gather from John Raniel, the first name on that list is in some dispute, so we're just using this to benchmark that we have actually got the history right and taking the opportunity to capture that. And then more recent things. And so John Hopes is in the audience, for anybody who doesn't know him, is now the Secretary of HORAF. And a couple of things there at the bottom. So John Raniel and I are just pulling together a history of HORAF. Well, there's still enough people around who can remember the history of HORAF to actually capture it and pass it on to the current HORAF leadership. So if there are any additional contributions, thoughts, errors and omissions, please let John and I know so that we've got the definitive list. And for anybody that wants to know about HORAF, wants to know more about HORAF, John's your man, and we're happy to furnish it. I can tell you what I think it does, but I stepped down a couple of years ago now, so John is very much in the lead for that. And with that, I will pause for any immediate questions or for a wider discussion.
We do have questions.
For people who are not in HORAF, are there any outputs that HORAF produces so that people can learn about?
Well, first off, there are minutes for HORAF, and quite often I will have let someone be interested in more possible or answer a copy of that.
So they're not made public on any website?
They're not made public on any website, but they can be made available. Also, we have commissioned various pieces of work that resulted in reports. Alan mentioned the soft OR report. That actually is on the OR Society website. So some of those things are available. While I'm answering that question,
Yeah, go on, John.
I think we've got a few members of HORAF here. I don't know if you want to stick definitely, I don't know, 3 or 4 I saw in the room. HORAF currently has, as Alan has said, over 50 representative member organisations, and over 70 individuals representing those organisations, because we do encourage organisations to have an alternate who can attend meetings if they can't. But, you know, we are always looking for new members, so I think if there's anybody here who, from what they've heard from Alan, is interested in joining, then, yeah, let me know, and we'll have a chat.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the quantitative increase, by a factor of about 5 since I was chairman of HORAF in 2003. And I mean, you just about sort of, kept us critical mass and kept us going. I mean, maybe about, we had about 10 members, maybe 12. And I mean, we certainly didn't sort of deliberately restrict ourselves in any way. I mean, we were always on the lookout for new people to contact and new groups to be represented. And obviously this was before the sort of analytics days. But I'll tell you, we were always trying to expand and put quite a lot of effort into tracking people down. So my question is, what has been the reason for the increase? Is it because, I mean, actually there are more OR-ish and analytics data analysis groups around, or has it just been the adding the A factor to HORAF? I mean, what's the trick?
So I think it's a bit of both of those. I think there are, as ever, OR is whatever we define OR to be, and so part of the reason we added the A was to demonstrate that we were inclusive, and if you didn't have OR in your job title, you couldn't be a member of HORAF. And I think there was a perception when people saw the acronym, they thought, well, that's not for me because it's not quite what I do. That's why we sometimes have discussions now about whether we ought to add a DS for data science or a ML for machine learning or a whatever to the title. So there is something about the name, the reach, and what folk expect to get out of it. I think huge kudos to John as Secretary, who put a lot of effort into what is our coverage, where do we get more coverage from, and how do we actually track that. And we put quite a lot of effort. We quite often get new organisations when somebody moves on who gets HORAF and is a member and takes it to their new organisation. What we find harder is to make sure that he's left the legacy behind, he or she has left the legacy behind in the organisation that they've gone from. Hence, as John Hopes was mentioning, why we try and have a main lead and a deputy, so at least then you've got some resilience if somebody moves on, retires, escapes, or whatever. There's still a point of contact in the organisation, and keeping those contacts live is a key part of it. John?
Just add to what Alan said. I mean, I was first sort of permanent secretary, and you can see I did it for a long time. There were a lot of ways I had the right background and had a lot of contact, but I didn't have time to track down organisations, sometimes through the history, for example. And I think that enabled us to expand the group quite significantly in, I think, about 14 years. And I started it in a sense because that was one of my presidential initiatives in 1988. And I was always a bit nervous about because I felt they needed to do things that benefited the members of the group. Now, there is a balance to keep between liaising with the society, letting the society use HORAF as a sounding board and so on. But I was very keen that there was some independent objective to satisfy the members of the organisation of HORAF. Great.
Do any of the groups represented have OR in their titles of the group?
There's still a few around, but most these days are data science or analytics or have got some other job title. I don't think either of our current co-chairs have got OR explicitly in their job titles. I do. I still do OR. But that's because defence is always a little bit behind and my job title will change, yeah. No, I do OR again now. I did OA for a number of years, but I do OR again now.
Because when I started out, there were lots of OR groups.
Yeah.
OR gradually disappeared from titles of analytic groups, disappeared from titles of OR degrees in universities and departments. That's the only major OR labels that society is.
You're quite right. And I don't know whether we've got any Copior reps in the room, but I'm sure if you ask the same question of Copior, there wouldn't be many people with OR explicitly in their title there either.
So I did say at the end we had a bit of discussion. We don't have a huge amount. But I think one of the things I would like to encourage is if there are people that have questions that maybe aren't relevant to individual specific presentations, but maybe there are observations. Because obviously what we've now seen is we've seen something that describes a sector, we've seen something that describes a particular group, and now we've seen something that's a more industry-wide forum. And it strikes me that in some of the had quite a lot of talk about technology and how changes in technology led to changes in our practice. We haven't heard very much, we've heard a little bit about techniques, we've heard a little bit about techniques, but we've heard quite a lot about organisation and about politics and things like that. So I was just wondering whether people have got any observations or thoughts that they want to pitch in about what all this tells us about, you know, how we've got to where we are and where we might be going in the future. Has anybody got any observations?
Resilience just is the word that springs to mind. Throughout the stories that Roger and John have told today, those two examples, I can think of other organisations, whether it's DA, which GAS, who actually also transferred into Hoskins, and British Steel, who transferred into Hoskins. And I did get a phone call from BA saying, if you think again, as you think again, Scotty. But I think resilience throughout a long period of time for the need of that analytical approach is what we all need to continue to hang our hats on. We're still relevant. Still very relevant.
Hands going up. Horace.
So I'm actually Colin Stewart. I was the named individual who's the dubious character.
Sorry, Colin.
I was a very junior whippersnapper at that point. I was very possibly a corporate status at that point in time. The reason why I was the R groups and all the talks today would confirm that. And that's why I think resilience, okay, so what you can for resilience is available to the organisation and also to the individuals who have the benefit of being part of those groups. And that's one thing my
I think building on that point, I think there's something really interesting here in what John said earlier on. You talked about the planning of essentially more tax code. It's really relatively straightforward to planning tax code. It's much more difficult planning strategic work. And actually, it's the strategic work that can often have enormous benefits, but we just can't really quantify. So So I think we're in this situation where we've got a huge amount to offer, but how we quantify it is a real challenge. Isn't it? How we show and demonstrate benefit, because if you can't continue to do that in this day and age, you have to go down.
Can I just have a point to that before we address it? There are two modes of operation of an library. One is consultancy oriented, where you go out and get projects without having a specific role, and you're as good as your project successful. I think that applies perhaps to most of the libraries, but more with analytics. They're part of the organisational structure with a defined role, and I think that does make a difference. I think in the main, we're all talking about consultancy orientation. We feel that's the case, or we feel that's changing at all.
Well, in terms of what goes on around, I think.
Yeah.
I think some of that is the way that people respond. If people have come to think of things as, that things are on demand, that you go there and you get things on demand rather than having things as integral. But I don't know about, I'm looking at it from the perspective of an independent consultant. So of course that's what I tend to do, but I'm guessing for a lot of Alan's, the organisation, part of Alan's, part of HORAF, they're often integral parts of the organisation, aren't they?
Said quite often, and one of the challenges we certainly have at council, it's helping wean the customers off the old stuff that is the stuff they understand, but isn't necessarily the most valuable stuff to them. So it's preserving that customer base and not alienating it, but moving them across to do something a bit clever with your data than the thing we've always done with your data in the past, or that we've done in other ways for you. So it's keeping that close relationship and helping them to move forward. Some customers are more enlightened than others. We like customers that come and say, here's our problem, can you help us solve it? Not the ones that say, can you apply some analytics to this, or we'd like a simulation of X, that's sort of left to the solution rather than giving us the problem to help us shape. So I sort of agree with John, but I think there's different modes across the client base, depending how, if you like, mature the relationship with the client is as well.
Yeah, I was very struck by the presentation you showed, is the emphasis on what's fundamentally positive. Establishing the links with the customers, stuff like public speaking courses, and how to communicate.
When I'm asking for success in an area that the country values highly, they are sometimes given that specific role on behalf of the organisation, not as a consultant, as it were, but as a manager of that particular, and that's happened quite a lot in British Coal, I think we call it over the years.
Yes, I thought it was particularly references to Lord Roland's, which was very prominent in Pat Robert's 1964 documentary, was the power of having somebody enthused for OR who is not necessarily an OR person themselves. Is that a common and ongoing thing? You need somebody like that who is basically going to channel you. Are the OR people like Merlin looking for one of them wants to be the next Arthur and so sponsor the magic that they perform?
And certainly through, the personal relationships are also very important to that kind of thing. So, people like that, you were saying, charismatic, in the end, people like that get to where they are by learning to trust particular people and then putting their weight behind them. The other thing I think we talked quite a bit about technology and sort of the it's always as a profession, I think we piggyback on this enormous transformation in that over the period we've been operating. Do people have any thoughts on that and the role of technology?
So I think, and back to something Roger said, not always good. It's great, but you've still got to use it effectively. Just because you've got more computing power doesn't mean that you need to use more computing power. So you still got to think about the problem and think about the best way of addressing the problem, not just cram more studying data into a simulation and expect to run it hundreds of times to get some insight when the actually uncertainties are so huge that it's not worth simulating in the first place. With my usual example, but yeah, there's huge power in analytics and machine learning, but you've still got to harness them, understand them.
And have a clear understanding of the problems which you're applying.
Yes, not every problem is a big problem. So that wouldn't necessarily require all the computing power.
I mean, that one thing I thought was quite striking, seeing the presentations, was how little techniques were mentioned. Loads of stuff about how people organise. I was a little bit, we talked about simulation, we talked about linear programming, but it was all quite, that was pretty much it, really. The last majority of that was about social and how things were organised and the kinds of things that those then, things like changes in technology let you do.
I mean, to be honest, John, a lot of the work that we undertook was common sense. You're applying an approach, an observation on data, mathematics, and building a model that you could then articulate to your client what the problem was and what the potential sources of resolution to the problems might be. Storytelling is just as important as the model itself and the technique that you use. If you can't get an animated client to then be able to talk to their team that this is the reason why we're going to replace the gearbox of the coal cutting machine next time it comes out at the end of the face, even though it's not yet broken down, because statistically we know there's a greater probability it's going to break down between here and the other end of the coal face. If it breaks down halfway through the phase, it's going to shut down the coal face for 2 days. Now, convincing an undermanager to convince the workers that that is the right approach is a real art as much as it is a science. You've got to be able to tell a story, you've got to convince them, and then you've got to stick, you've got to be resilient in what you've just done. It's not all about the actual technique or power of computing or whatever else. It's a story.
Yeah, interestingly, in systems thinking, second half the other day, I thought about it. Storytelling. So, I think we've now just about hit the end of our time. So, but if there are any other thoughts that anybody wants to raise before we...
Can I just really like to thank John, because he never gets any praise and impact, so I just wanted to pop up and
Thank you very much all for attending. Thank you for our presenters for providing the insights.